building the bridge between assets and access. When we talk about digital asset management, it's not just about storing files, it's about building systems that make those assets discoverable, scalable, and useful across industries like healthcare, consumer goods, and nonprofit organizations. Joining me is my colleague and thought partner, Saj Hoffman Hussein. Together, we'll unpack how metadata and taxonomies transform words into frameworks. Or, as Saj puts it, metadata is utility, not perfection. It's about usability. Let's get started. Part one, we start with framing the landscape. For you, Saj, question one, what do we mean when we say metadata and taxonomies are the backbone of damn systems?
Kind of think about it like a skeletal structure. Metadata are the descriptive labels that really give those assets meaning, whilst, taxonomies are those frameworks that really kind of help organize labels into relationships. And together, it really helps to enable, that findability, that scale and that ability to really reuse content as well.
Excellent, excellent. So, in practice, what changes for a team once metadata is in place?
Well, a couple of things change. For example, you have order where before there was chaos, and so if you think about how content is categorized, oftentimes we're given many different types of content asks, and we're put in a position of being almost order takers, taking somebody's order like we're in a restaurant. The problem with that is often that each recipe is unique and has its own distinct flavor. And if you're not careful, you can end up with a mess. And so, what you need really is some sort of order or system to kind of gather those requests and to really organize the content in a way that makes sense. And so, having descriptive labels, having easily understandable frameworks, having those interactions that are really easily accessible really helps streamline the process of content retrieval and also content use as well.
All right, all right. It sounds good. Can't relate to, especially those agency days and then major corporation days. So, how do you explain the difference between a controlled vocabulary, a taxonomy, and a metadata model to someone outside our field?
Well, I liken it as, I spoke about this in the previous episode. Controlled vocabulary is all about defining key terms in a way that you understand what's approved by those definitions. So, like, for example, the meaning of doctor versus physician. And then when we're thinking about it from a taxonomical perspective, we're looking at, how are those terms structured hierarchically? So for example, you have the medical profession, MD, doctor, physician, physician's assistant. And then how do you really map those in a metadata model? So that's the map that ties those vocabularies and taxonomies and from a technical perspective into those kind of asset fields. So when you have a table that you're putting into the CMS, that what the top level label references to the primary, secondary, and tertiary labels as well.
Yes, that's right. It does help set the stage. And then now we're going to be talking about the real world when the teams get stuck and our structure saves the time in the practical application. Now, what is the biggest mistake? What's the biggest mistake organizations make when setting up metadata frameworks? What have you been seeing?
I think they make it too complicated. And so part of that is looking at how they really use the massive information they have. They want to throw everything at the problem like the kitchen sink. So they start, really overloading those metadata fields and making it really complex. And then to compound the problem, they don't establish any sort of content governance, which leads to a lot of sprawl and duplication of effort and redundancy. And one of the worst things they do is really just treat it as a kind of one-off project rather than I would say, a regular, a maintenance or a living system effort as well. So it's something that is not a one and done effort. It's something that you need to constantly monitor and evaluate for effectiveness.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing too. that as we get further into, just little points to reiterate is like it's not a set it forget it kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's the complete opposite that you explained. So you're right. Think just going forward. How do you approach designing a taxonomy that works across multiple industries?
So to think about that, you really have to kind of zoom out. What's the big picture goal that you're trying to achieve here, right? You're trying to look at how to make that kind of multi-pronged, multi-channel approach, right? Multi-vertically approach, challenged approach, for want of a better word. So you're gonna look at getting those universal categories that make sense around that. Whether you're looking at the type of audiences that are being served, the type of channels that we're using, type of
Right.
campaigns that are being initiated, and then you're gonna identify through competitive research any of those kind of industry specific attributes. So, for example, compliance tags in healthcare. Looking at the kind of SKU labels in consumer goods. And then start off with one department, do a quick pilot on that, and then from there you can scale your findings as well.
All right. All right. Yeah, these good practices, they do matter.
Mm-hmm.
Scaling across teams and countries is a real test. And I think we've seen it and we're going to start unpacking it. I think in the building for scale, this next session is how can teams avoid over engineering metadata models so they don't become rigid or unusable. So I'm sure you have some good examples to share
All right,
and
so
use.
I have some thoughts on this, and it goes back to the lack of content governance. Because what tends to happen is that you either get too regimented and say I need to stick to those rules regardless, no matter what, um, or they're too loose and easy, and it leads to that kind of unclear clarity of purpose and lack of definition. So what there really needs to be is that kind of middle ground, where less is more, and where you're planning on indexing on the things that you really want to index on. So like looking at those 8 to 10 metadata fields to start as well, and you can't really plan for every single eventuality. That's not realistic. So really avoiding every edge use case, identifying that through QA, designing
Yes.
designing for that 90% use case, and then really also planning with a future facing forward look, looking at the trends that are happening up ahead, so that you can refine your model as you need to. So, and also most importantly, make sure that you're thinking about the user, keeping those labels user friendly, so that if, for example, you move off a project, you're not going to be the only one who can understand those labels,
Right.
or it's going to be somebody who's a taxonomist is the only person who can understand the label. You can leave it with somebody who doesn't have that necessary knowledge and is going to have
Right.
to start from scratch. So keep those labels user friendly, not kind of librarian only.
Right. Indeed. Especially with keeping the rules user friendly is like another point we're gonna expand into is what is the role of governance playing in keeping taxonomies sustainable over time, even though we've established that we're looking to maintain user friendly, and then the governance is the next step with
Yeah.
user friendly.
So, I mean, like governance is really important because now it not only establishes that sustainability, but also establishes ownership and responsibility, which I feel gives people skin in the game, right? So,
Right.
being able to assign, taxonomy stewards who aren't just IT based, although we know that IT does like to, lead on that.
Right.
So, for example, a practical example was when I worked for a healthcare organization, identifying stakeholder owners for different sites and section pages of the different portals. For example, the broker and the wellness portal. And then from that you can establish some sort of cadence or quarterly review to look at those terms that have been defined and decide whether they're fit for use still or whether they need to be updated as well. And then in particular having that onboarding and implementation set up so that new folks can again understand what's happening in terms of the terminology for new staff onboarding. Having that new staff onboarding is really important.
Indeed. Indeed. And that importance is how we're able to discuss standardization and how do you balance it with flexibility, especially you mentioned with global organizations where markets and languages vary.
So we've spoken a lot about standardization. And again, standardization is really important. So looking at, how those top level categories are standardized from a product region campaign perspective, and thinking about the different nuances and allowing flexibility across those local vocabularies. So, for example, the cultural terms, language variations, could be language specific currency type nuances. For example, if you're creating like global currency features, and having that layered approach where you're going from a global level right down through to kind of a local regional level as well. And that can vary. It could be from for example, a Europe perspective or an Asia Pacific perspective, going all the way down to like a country perspective, going down to a town perspective, that kind of thing as well. But I'm curious also, and this is where I'm going to ask you, Abdul, what do you think?
Um, I think that we need to assort. I feel like one thing is really generate a council. I think who really understands the procedures and the framework and how to manage compliance when doing the project sprint. And I think the council needs to be elected by the senior leadership, needs to come into part. A key member who's able to survey the development to maintain the tone, voice, and the language when we are able to design and maintain collaboration throughout the sprint and ensure that there's going to be no delays or bottlenecks as we're able to build loops.
Awesome. So yeah, really, I agree with that too. Having that layered approach, where there's that global spine, local branches, making sure there's flexibility in those local vocabularies and standardizing those top level categories is going to be so, so important.
Indeed, indeed. And I think looking ahead, seems like too with the AI and automation advancing, going a little deeper to it. Like, how do you see the metadata models evolving to support smart servicing of assets?
So I'm already seeing where folks are using, LLMs almost as a digital asset management
Right.
repository, and in a way, a smart repository where they can surface those tags automatically. And I think the next logical step for that is to have specific GPTs around generating tags automatically, for example, for image recognition. And for that, human metadata is going to remain absolutely critical for that governance and that nuance around there. So we'll need that hybrid approach, with AI speeding up implementation of tagging while humans maintain quality.
Excellent, excellent. Because I think this hybrid approach with AI speed tagging and then the humans maintain the quality is going to be really, really critical
Mm.
to keep the nuance up to date and also maintain the budget. Because at the end of the day, it's always about the budget when there's a wrap up. So moving on to another question of, is there one practical step that listeners should take tomorrow to strengthen their metadata framework? What would it be?
Well, keeping it simple or as simple
Yes.
as you can do, I think you should focus on auditing what your current offering is, your current metadata is, looking at, what gaps there are in terms of fields and users and context, and just focusing on those small wins, those small cleanups, which will help, provide an instant usability boost and give you some insight that you can use to kind of move forward, and plan the way that you're gonna, look at, taxonomy and look at like how you kind of categorize your content afterwards and tag your content.
Indeed, indeed. Because control your vocabulary stays with categorization. So as we close out, thanks a lot for breaking down the power of metadata taxonomies. We've been discussing a little more in this session that structure isn't about perfection. It's more about creating utility and usability, which is now too because it's scattered across engines. And for the listeners, they need to remember that turning vocabularies into structured systems is what makes your dam scalable and your assets findable. So, closing down in episode 3, structure. Join us next time as we continue building bridges between content, technology, and strategy. Until then, This is Abdul Fatai Smile. Thanks for listening. We out.